The fall of Haven's Rest was never supposed to be important. Tucked away in the Outer Rim territories, 3 jumps past the last major trade route, it existed as little more than a mining operation and a testament to human stubbornness. The planet itself was unremarkably brown and orange world with thin atmosphere and harsh winds. But beneath its surface lay the largest known deposits of quantum crystals in human space, the rare minerals that powered faster-than-light communication. Across the galaxy dot 5,000 souls called Haven's Rest home. Miners, mostly, along with their families, a handful of scientists, and the administrative staff needed to keep a frontier colony running. They lived in prefabricated domes, connected by covered walkways, their lives regulated by the rhythm of the mining shifts and the quarterly supply runs from Earth. Children played in the recreation domes, their laughter echoing off metal walls. Parents worked 12-hour shifts in the deep mines, coming home covered in crystal dust that sparkled like stars under the artificial lights. Colony Administrator Sarah Chen had been on Haven's Rest for 8 years. She'd watched those children grow up, presided over weddings, mourned the few deaths that came with dangerous work. To the rest of humanity, Haven's Rest was a dot on a star chart. To Sarah, it was home. To the 5,000 colonists who woke up each morning under the pale light of a distant star, it was everything. The morning the Kethmori came, Sarah was reviewing quarterly production reports. The quantum crystal yields were up 18% from last year. She was composing her report to Earth's command, thinking about her daughter Lisa's upcoming birthday, when the proximity alarms began screaming. At first, the colonists thought it was another meteor shower. Haven's Rest sat in a system with an unstable asteroid belt, and rocks big enough to damage the surface installations came through the planet's thin atmosphere twice a year. The children were shuffled into reinforced shelters, while the adults prepared damage control procedures they'd practiced dozens of times. But Sarah Chen had served 20 years in the Terran Navy before accepting the administrator position. She knew the difference between meteors and ships. The sensor readings made her blood run cold. 17 massive vessels, each one larger than Earth's biggest dreadnoughts, were dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. Their energy signatures were unlike anything in human databases. Sarah activated the emergency communication array and sent a priority transmission to Earth. "This is Haven's Rest Colony, Administrator Chen speaking. We have unknown vessels approaching. Our position, repeat, unknown vessels, hostile intent unclear, requesting immediate assistance." The response came back 47 minutes later, delayed by the vast distance to Earth. "Haven's Rest, this is Earth Command. No scheduled arrivals in your sector. Maintain defensive posture and attempt communication with unknown vessels. Relief. Fleet dispatched. Arrival in 6 days. 6 days. Sarah stared at the communication console, knowing with absolute certainty that they didn't have 6 hours. The unknown ships were already past the outer planets, their formation tight and purposeful. These weren't explorers or traders. This was a fleet. She tried everything. Open channels on all frequencies, mathematical sequences, even crude pictographs. Transmitted on basic radio. The approaching ships maintained perfect silence. No response to any communication attempt. No acknowledgement that Haven's Rest even existed. The attack began at 1427 colony time. No warning, no ultimatum, no demand for surrender. The lead Kethmori vessel simply opened fire on the orbital communication relay, vaporizing it in a burst of coherent energy. Then they turned their weapons on the surface installations. The mining domes were the first to die. Precise energy beams punched through their reinforced walls like they were made of paper. The residential sections followed. Then the power plants, the water recycling facilities, the hydroponics gardens that kept the colony alive. Each strike was calculated, methodical, designed to eliminate any possibility of survival. Sarah Chen spent her last moments in the emergency command bunker, 100 meters underground, watching her colony die on the security monitors. The children in the shelters lasted longest, their reinforced walls buying them precious extra minutes. She heard them crying over the communication systems, calling for parents who were already gone. With the main transmitter destroyed, Sarah activated the emergency quantum relay, a device barely powerful enough to reach the nearest navigation beacon. The signal would take 3 days to bounce through the relay network to Earth, but it was the only chance to tell humanity what had happened. She spoke quickly, knowing the power cells would die in minutes. This is Administrator Sarah Chen, Havens Rest Colony. We are under attack by unknown alien vessels. 17 ships, massive scale, no attempt at communication. They're killing everyone, the children. God, the children are in the shelters, but the power's failing, and the bunker shook as another energy beam punched through the surface above. Rock dust rained from the ceiling. Tell Earth, tell them we tried to surrender. We tried to talk. They wouldn't listen. They just ... They just started killing us. Her voice broke. Tell my sister on Lunar Base that I love her. Tell her that Lisa was going to be 10 next month. She wanted a real horse for her birthday. Can you believe that? A horse out here in the black. The lights flickered and went out. Emergency. Power kicked in, bathing everything in red light. Sarah could hear the air recycling system failing. The familiar hum that had been the heartbeat of the colony for 8 years finally going silent. Sarah Chen, Havens Rest Colony, final log. Time is 1543. Colony integrity has failed. All surface installations destroyed. No survivors detected on sensors. Unknown alien vessels have commenced systematic destruction of all human presence in this system. The quantum relay sparked and died. In the sudden silence, Sarah Chen heard only her own breathing and the distant rumble of energy weapons, reducing her home to ash. She closed her eyes and thought about her daughter's laughter, about the way Lisa's eyes lit up when she talked, about horses she'd only seen in pictures. The signal reached Earth 3 days later. For 72 hours, Earth Command tried to re-establish contact with Havens Rest. They sent priority messages, activated emergency protocols, even redirected to patrol ships from nearby systems. But the void that had swallowed Havens Rest remained absolute. No response to any frequency, no energy signatures detected by long-range sensors. 5,000 human lives had simply vanished from the galaxy. Admiral Marcus Rivera was in his office on Lunar Base when the final confirmation came in. A deep space reconnaissance probe had reached the Havens Rest system and transmitted its findings. The planet was still there, still spinning in its orbit around a pale yellow star. But where the mining colony had stood, where 5,000 people had lived and worked and raised their children, there was nothing but fused glass and scattered debris. Rivera had spent 40 years in the Terran Navy. He'd fought pirates in the Outer Rim, negotiated treaties with 3 different alien species, and commanded the fleet that established humanity's first permanent base beyond the solar system. He'd seen war and death and the cold vastness of space that cared nothing for human dreams. But He'd never seen anything like this. The probe's images showed a level of destruction that went beyond military necessity. Every structure had been obliterated, every trace of human presence systematically erased. This wasn't conquest or even warfare in any traditional sense. This was extermination. The admiral stood at his office window, looking out at the sprawling naval yards of Lunar Base. Thousands of ships floated in the construction docks, destroyers, cruisers, the massive dreadnoughts that served as humanity's shields against the dark. For 50 years, those ships had been enough. The galaxy's other species knew that humanity could defend itself, could strike back at any aggressor with overwhelming force. But Haven's Rest proved that overwhelming force might not be enough. Whoever had destroyed the colony possessed weapons, and ships that surpassed anything in human arsenals. They'd struck without warning, without negotiation, without mercy. They'd killed 5,000 innocent people and disappeared back into the dark between stars. Rivera activated his command console and began typing the orders that would change everything. Within 6 hours, every Terran naval vessel in known space received the same message. Protocol Omega was now in effect. All ships were to return immediately to Earth space for reassignment. All shore leave was cancelled, all maintenance schedules accelerated, all construction projects given absolute priority. Protocol Omega hadn't been invoked since the formation of the Terran Republic 2 centuries earlier. It meant that humanity faced an existential threat, that the survival of the species might depend on the next few decisions made in the halls of power on Earth and Luna. The industrial might of 23 worlds turned toward a single purpose. Shipyards that had been producing cargo haulers and civilian transports retooled for military production. Mining operations that fed rare metals to commercial manufacturers diverted their output to naval construction. Every human world with the capability began building warships. In the deep archives beneath Geneva, technicians activated databases that hadn't been touched in generations. Ship designs from the early expansion wars, weapon systems deemed too destructive for peacetime use, strategic doctrines written for total war against an implacable enemy. Humanity began to remember what it had been before the galaxy knew to fear it. The message was simple and absolute. Haven's Rest would be avenged. The species that had murdered 5,000 innocent humans would learn why Earth was called the Death World, why humanity had carved an empire from the hostile galaxy despite being younger and smaller than most of their neighbors. They would learn that there were prices too terrible to pay, lines too sacred to cross, and they would learn that when humanity went to war, they didn't stop until their enemies remembered why the galaxy had learned to fear the children of Earth. Asterisk. The storm unleashed 6 months after Haven's Rest died. The greatest fleet in human history assembled in Earth orbit. 700,000 warships from every corner of human space, their hulls gleaming under the light of Sol. Destroyers built for speed and precision. Cruisers armed with weapons that could crack a moon. Dreadnoughts the size of cities, their armor thick enough to shrug off nuclear fire. And at the center of it all, the new flagship of the Terran Navy, the THS Vengeance, a ship so large it had to be built in the void between worlds. Admiral Marcus Rivera stood on the Vengeance's bridge, looking out at the assembled fleet through reinforced viewports. Each ship represented months of frantic construction, the combined industrial output of 23 worlds focused on a single goal. The numbers were staggering more firepower than had ever been assembled in the history of the galaxy. Enough destructive force to sterilize entire star systems. But Rivera wasn't thinking about numbers or firepower. He was thinking about Sarah. Chun's final message about a little girl named Lisa who'd wanted a horse for her 10th birthday. About 5,000 people who'd died for the crime of existing in the path of an alien species that saw other life as nothing more than obstacles to be removed. The Kethmori Empire had made contact with humanity 3 weeks after the fleet assembly began. Their diplomatic vessel had appeared at the edge of the Sol system, transmitting what their translators claimed was a standard greeting between starfaring civilizations. They spoke of trade opportunities and cultural exchange, of the mutual benefits that came from cooperation between advanced species. They made no mention of Haven's Rest. Rivera had watched the recordings of those first diplomatic meetings, studying the alien delegates with cold fury. The Kethmori were tall, elegant beings with crystalline skin that reflected light in shifting patterns. They spoke in harmonic tones that their translators rendered as calm. Reasonable voices discussing mineral rights and shipping lanes. They behaved as if they'd never heard of a human colony called Haven's Rest. As if 5,000 murdered humans were so insignificant that they didn't warrant discussion. The Galactic Council had intervened, of course. Representatives from a dozen species arrived at Earth, offering to mediate the dispute, to find a peaceful solution that would avoid bloodshed. They spoke of the Kethmori's right to expand their territory, of the unfortunate misunderstanding that had led to the colony's destruction. They offered reparations credits and rare metals to compensate for humanity's loss. Rivera had listened to their proposals with growing disgust. To the Galactic Council, Haven's Rest was a minor incident, a footnote in the complex negotiations between starfaring species. They couldn't understand why humanity was mobilizing for war over a single lost colony. Thousands of species had suffered similar losses during their expansion into space. It was the natural order of things. But humanity had never accepted the natural order of things. They'd clawed their way off a death world that should have killed them before they developed agriculture. They'd survived ice ages and plague and nuclear war. They'd looked at a hostile galaxy and decided to make it their home, despite every rational voice that said they were too weak, too divided, too young to compete with ancient civilizations. The Kethmori had made the same mistake as every other species that had underestimated humanity. They'd assumed that humans would respond to Haven's Rest, the way other species responded to territorial disputes with negotiation, compromise, and eventual acceptance of the status quo. They'd killed 5,000 humans and expected the rest of humanity to mourn quietly and move on. Instead, they'd awakened something that had been sleeping in the human heart since the species first looked at the stars and decided to claim them. The fleet departed Earth on the anniversary of Haven's Rest's destruction. 700,000 warships moving as one, their formation stretching across millions of kilometers of space. It was a sight that would have been impossible to comprehend. For the humans who'd first reached for the stars centuries earlier, the combined industrial and military might of humanity's 23 worlds focused on a single purpose. The journey to Kethmori space took 3 weeks through hyperspace. As the fleet traveled, word of their passage spread throughout the galaxy. Species that had dismissed humanity as irrelevant suddenly paid attention to the massive armada moving. Through neutral space, trading vessels fled their path. Military patrols gave them wide berth. The galaxy had never seen anything like the Terran Retribution fleet. The Galactic Council sent increasingly desperate messages. They offered sanctions against the Kethmori Empire, demanded reparations for Haven's Rest, even threatened to expel the Kethmori from council membership, but Rivera ignored their communications. The time for diplomacy had ended in the smoking ruins of a mining colony where children had died calling for parents, who could no longer answer. When the fleet reached the edge of Kethmori space, they found a defensive line waiting for them. 2,000 Kethmori warships in perfect formation, their crystalline hulls gleaming with stored energy. It was the largest fleet the Empire had ever assembled, drawn from garrison forces across their territory. Against any other species, it would have been an overwhelming show of force. Against 700,000 human warships, it lasted 18 minutes. The battle was less a fight than a demonstration of industrial capacity. Human missiles blotted out the stars, their contrails forming a web of destruction that reached across light-minus of space. Energy weapons designed to crack fortress worlds fired in perfectly coordinated volleys. The Kethmori formation simply vanished, overwhelmed by a scale of firepower they couldn't have imagined. But Rivera didn't stop there. The fleet pressed deeper into Kethmori space, moving from system to system with methodical precision. They destroyed military installations, orbital shipyards, the industrial infrastructure that supported the Empire's expansion. They didn't target civilian populations, didn't bombard inhabited worlds, but they systematically dismantled the Kethmori's ability to threaten human space ever again. The Empire's surrender came on the 5th day of the campaign. The Emperor himself transmitted the message, his harmonic voice carrying tones of shock and desperation that the translators rendered as barely controlled panic. He offered complete capitulation, reparations beyond imagining, even the execution of the commanders who had ordered Haven's Rest's destruction. Rivera listened to the surrender terms from the Bridge of the Vengeance, surrounded by displays showing the systematic destruction of the Kethmori military. The alien emperor was offering everything humanity could possibly want: territory, resources, tribute payments that would make Earth rich beyond measure. But Rivera had learned something about humanity during the long months of preparation for this campaign. They weren't conquerors in the traditional sense. They didn't want to rule the Kethmori Empire or strip their worlds bare. They wanted something much simpler and much more terrifying. They wanted to be remembered. The terms Rivera transmitted back to the Kethmori Emperor were unprecedented in galactic history. The Empire would pay reparations not in credits or resources, but in memory. They would build a monument to Haven's Rest on their capital world, with the name of every human who died there carved in their own crystalline architecture. They would teach their children about the colony, about Sarah Chen and her daughter who wanted a horse, about 5,000 lives snuffed out without warning or mercy. Most importantly, they would remember that humanity was not a species to be dismissed or ignored. The galaxy was vast and full of ancient civilizations, but there was only one species that responded to the murder of 5,000 innocent people by building 700,000 warships and crossing half the galaxy. For vengeance, the Retribution fleet returned to Earth 9 months after it had departed. The victory celebrations lasted for weeks, but Admiral Rivera found little joy in humanity's triumph. He'd proven that humanity could build fleets large enough to make the galaxy tremble, could project force across distances that other species found impossible to imagine. But he'd also proven something darker. When pushed far enough, when their children were threatened and their innocents murdered, humans didn't just fight back. They became something that made the ancient powers of the galaxy step aside and reconsider everything they thought they knew about the young species from the Death World. The Kethmori kept their word. The monument to Haven's Rest stood on their capital world, a crystal spire that caught the light of their binary suns and scattered it in patterns. that reminded every observer of the price of underestimating humanity. Children learned about the mining colony in their schools, about the species that had responded to tragedy with overwhelming force, and across the galaxy, other species looked at their own expansion plans and territorial ambitions with new eyes. They remembered the sight of 700,000 human warships moving through the dark between stars, remembered the systematic destruction of the Kethmori military, remembered that there were lines that couldn't be crossed without consequences beyond imagination. Humanity had earned something more valuable than territory or resources. They'd earned the one thing that kept species alive in a hostile galaxy filled with ancient powers and competing civilizations. They'd earned respect through strength and memory through sacrifice. Haven's Rest would never be forgotten, and neither would the lesson its destruction had taught the galaxy about the children of Earth.